Okay, well, welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're hosting a webinar on digital investigations for private investigators. My name is Amber Schroeder, and I'm the CEO and founder here at Paraben Corporation. I'm going to be giving your webinar and going through these different areas for digital investigations. Also in the webinar, I have Shannon Gomez. She is our Director of Sales. She's going to be the one that's going to field different questions. To make it easier, she'll bring the little quick stop that says, hey, Amber, we have a couple questions here. So you can use the little chat option in your Zoom to ask questions that might be relevant about different sections, and then we'll get going from there. All right, so let's start out with the three big areas we're going to focus on. We've got multiple areas of digital forensics. I'm sure many of you have heard of these or you've hired people for different areas of this. We're going to focus on all the ones that are in orange. So we're going to look at mobile forensics, digital forensics in general as a whole, and computer and media forensics. In the green area, you see I have cloud forensics marked. I have that one marked because we have a webinar on April 29th that will address very specific things about all the different aspects of the cloud that's going to be given by our VP of Cyber, Greg Kipper. So that will be on April 29th at 2 p.m. The network forensics, database forensics, and live forensics, when we're dealing with active memory capture to a computer, things like that, we might address those in other webinars at different times, but we thought the most important ones were the areas that you're going to get the most value for you in your investigations. So in general, the goal of digital forensics is to produce data from different digital sources. Not a big shock there, digital forensics and getting data off of them. Our digital data sources that we focus on in most cases are computers and smartphones or mobile phones. Those are where most of you are going to get the additional information when you're doing an investigation that's going to make the biggest impact for you. Now that cloud has become popular and even more popular now with everyone working remotely, that cloud aspect is something that you need to consider because there are extra steps you have to go through with that cloud. And as I mentioned, April 29th for a webinar on that topic. So what I'm going to cover in this webinar is how digital evidence can help you in your cases, what the digital forensic process actually is associated with both computers and mobile devices, what data you can get recovered from those so you kind of have an expectation. The expectation is nice because then you're able to tell your clients what they can expect, and then you also know what to expect when you're hiring outside sources to do your digital forensics. And then how digital forensics, the data that can be recovered, and then how digital forensics is actually billed out. A lot of times people will get into the field and one of the guys on the Geek Squad will say, like, I'm now a forensic expert or a data recovery expert, and they start billing you out this, and they're taking advantage of you. And I want to make sure at the end of this that you feel comfortable in what you're getting billed and you're understanding what processes there are that go into that billing, or if you decide to offer this as a service within your organization and firm, that you know what kind of the going rates are for it around the country. So, first area, how digital evidence can help you. So this is one of my favorite websites to visit. I think it plays to the ADD side of me so much, and that is the internet in real time. And it kind of constantly updates information and details on it of what is changing. And I just did a quick capture of it. But in that quick capture, we saw that we have 496,628 gigabytes of data that was generated in 22 seconds. That alone should just tell you why digital evidence can be so valuable to you, because that is what your potential suspects are doing. And you should know, in general, I always call suspects of everything. I have 3 kids, so I just automatically assume they're suspicious of everything. And so I just lovingly call everyone a suspect. I'm sure you don't think of your clients that way, but sometimes it's just easier to have a blanket suspect. So as I use that throughout, please know that I'm referencing the data that you're going to be investigating, because you see anything from social media, from Twitter to Facebook, where you might have heard about this webinar, to the actual data they're doing on their machines, which might be what are they watching on YouTube at this given moment, how many emails are they sending or receiving, to what they're doing on their actual device. Are they shopping? Are they on Instagram? Are they on Snapchat? Whatever. Each one of those are a different digital fingerprint that you can then go through and process and recover as part of what we do in digital forensics. So this is my blanket warning, and I always say this because I am not a lawyer. So I want to make sure it's very clear up front that you need to make sure you have all your documentation in place with your client, or with the firm that you're using prior to starting any examinations. Make sure you have any consent associated with it as well. Every state is a little different on what the legal requirements are, but consent is super important for both the devices on who actually is the owner of those devices and who is the owner of the data on those devices, as well as have a letter of engagement with your clients and your forensic consultant named in it, or the ability to change your letter of engagement so that you can name an outside party to do specialized work and that they would be protected under original letter of engagement. Many times in the digital forensic side, there is material that you can come across as a forensic expert that would be considered illegal, and that material has to be reported. So we have that in our letter of engagement when we do professional services at Paraben, that if we find any of that illegal content, we automatically report it to the authorities, and the authorities immediately take custody of that. So you want to make sure your firm is protected as you bring in this type of evidence so you don't have any liability on your side. And some minor tweaks in your letter of engagement can make that really easy for you. And I'm happy to share details on what's in our letter of engagement, as well as our consent forms after the webinar is over. All right, so now we're getting into the good stuff, the digital forensic stuff. So we have digital forensics is like an equilateral triangle. And I know you're thinking, wow, I'm getting homeschooled now on geometry. So all sides technically should be equal when you're dealing with it. So I have my seizure side, I have my imaging and acquisition, and then I have my analysis side. When I'm doing forensics or I'm hiring anyone outside in forensics, I want to make sure I get all three of those aspects from the investigation back to me as the primary firm. So we're going to look at each one of these areas. Now, what happens when you hire a firm and they say, okay, well, I'm only doing this imaging, and then they give you back this image? The problem is your triangle is then going to be out of balance. And so that's where you know you're not getting 100% of the services that you should be getting from that firm. So let's go into those different areas. Let's start with seizure. I think a seizure is the most important one for you. And the reason seizure is so valuable for you is it's where you're interacting directly with your clients. So you're going to participate the most in this stage, and you want to make sure when you participate in this stage that you follow what we call as best practices. I'm sure as a private investigator, you have similar practices in your types of investigations you do, but when we follow our best practices in digital forensics, it's to guarantee that we're going to get the optimal amount of data off of whatever we're going to capture or seize in this process. So let's start it out with computers. I know many of you are thinking, oh, you know, it's the same old, but there are a couple of special handling things you need to do with computers to make sure that you're going to get the best possible data. Now, before anything that we're dealing with now globally happened, I always have instituted wearing gloves. I am not a big super fan of making sure I step in touch with someone else's machine without being protected on my side. That, and just in case you are going to do anything and it's going to go to the next level and you want biological, it's always good to protect yourself and make sure that the evidence itself is protected as well. Next, you're going to start a chain of custody. Whether it's the client going and giving the device to you, so you're taking custody of that computer, or you're the first custodian of it, you want to start that chain of custody right off. Whether you're going to go to court with it or not, it's always good paperwork to have in, because good paperwork is good protection for you. And so I always recommend that you have a chain of custody started with no matter what type of digital evidence. Even if it's a thumb drive, start a chain of custody. It's just a piece of paper. So the next thing, take everything. So machine, power cords, media cards, thumb drives, everything that they have available to you, you want to make sure you're taking it. And the reason is a lot of people, when they're in that stressful situation that usually is involved in that investigative stage, they're going to miss something. And you want to make sure you do one level of collection, not have to go back again and again, because that's going to end up costing you more money in the long run. So collect everything that they might have. You never know when an old backup for an iPhone might be on a media device or an external drive, whatever it may be. It's always better to have more than less. Once you actually seize everything, you can then choose where you want to focus your imaging and your collection on after you have it all. But it's really hard to do it after the fact. You
Amber,
also, yeah.
we have a recurring question about if the slide deck will be available to the attendees after this, or if there will be a recording.
Yes, I'm going to do actually a checklist for everyone. I know everyone's probably laughing about that, but I'm a big fan of the checklist. So I've created a very easy one-page document that kind of summarizes this. You can tell I'm a child of the Cliff Notes age. So I've made a Cliff Notes version of the slides that we'll make available after. Shannon will reach out to all of you and provide that. And then I'm going to do a recording of the presentation as well that can be watched later. And put that out in an investigative group so you guys can all have access to it as well. Okay. So as far as taking everything, one of the big things is machine power cord. I know that sounds really silly, but I've done a lot of cases where someone doesn't seize that. There's no way for your forensic person to finish the process without being able to have power. So make sure you get all those little things. You don't need the mouse, you don't need the keyboard. You should check those just in case there's passwords on them, because people do that. But do make sure you're getting the primary things like power cords, media cards, thumb drives, external hard drives, etc. Now you want to document the process with photos. There's a lot of really cool apps out there that will actually let you record it just like you would doing a traditional crime scene. They're free in the different app stores, but you're welcome to just use your smartphone, take pictures, and then after that is done, I started chain of custody by emailing those pictures to my email that says this is the time I finished them. I have all the date timestamps of my seizure and everything's tidy for my overall case file. When you pack it to send it, make sure you pack it securely. You want to use, typically try to use bubble wrap, things like that that are not going to damage the electronics. It's not great when you use things like towels and different rags and things to wrap stuff up because you're adding different layers of materials to the different electronics. They're not a big fan of that. Some things can be pretty sensitive depending on what level of examination you're doing. And then make sure you put it securely in a box. The nice thing is both FedEx and UPS, which you need to pick a trackable carrier, they offer boxes designed specifically for computers, so laptops to smartphones, that prohibit them from moving. So that's one of the nicest ways for you to transfer them back and forth to your lab you're going to use, or even for your client to send them in to you if you're going to start doing this in your own lab. So mobile computers are kind of the low maintenance side of things, but for mobile seizure, we still have the same thing. So even more so with the wearing gloves, because as you can imagine, phones are much dirtier than computers are. So you want to make sure that you're keeping them and yourself clean and safe as possible. You're going to start chain of custody just like you would on a computer. It's fine if you're sending them all together to have one chain of custody for everything. You just have to itemize each item that you're sending as part of that chain of custody. You want to, again, take everything. Smartphones, just like computers, because they're almost the equivalent of them as far as computing processing power, you want to take the device, the power cords, even though you might think, hey, my iPhone power cord's super common, I'm sure the lab has one. Make sure that you have the one that your suspect had, just because it's going to be paired to that device and you know that this is a good choice. The same thing with media cards, Bluetooth accessories, all of those things can make a big impact. And I'm going to give you an example here. I'm sure you guys can see in the little video in Zoom. I have my fitness band on. I'm pretty religious about wearing my fitness band. It makes a nerd feel like she's getting a lot more of a workout in her day than normal. And in doing so, this is paired to my device. So different things like that can actually help unlock devices, and I can get different synchronized data off of it based on a different process I would follow in the lab to update it. So you make sure you take those little things and they can make a big impact in the type of digital evidence you'll end up getting. Document it with photos just as you would with the computer side, but now this is where we kind of jump to a different level, which is with mobile devices and wireless devices in general, you should be placing them inside a Faraday bag. Those Faraday bags are designed to block all the signal that are going to the device, and they make sure that it's not going to have any data overwritten in the transmission process, or it's not going to get wiped remotely, different things like that. That is what a Faraday bag is designed for. It's made to be a cone of silence for your evidence. And so this is something you want to watch for. If you do not have a Faraday bag, because I know many of you are thinking, what is this thing and I don't have it, document the process you're going to do to prepare that evidence to go off to your forensic lab or to come to you if your client doesn't have one, so that you know for sure you've protected it with, again, those best practices. And I'm going to show you kind of the alternate not as awesome branch, but still a branch option.
Amber, we have a question. If someone does use our services and sends the mobile device in a Faraday bag, will we return the Faraday bag?
Yes, if it's part of their process, we will send them back to you. Once we finish with all the evidence, we return everything back to you that came into us. We don't keep it. And then our last two steps are, of course, package it securely and choose a trackable carrier. I'm going to show you how to now protect a mobile device with the not as awesome option as a Faraday bag, which is going to probably end up being used a little more commonly with most of you than you will with a Faraday bag. Faraday bag is when it's a perfect day, everything's working in your favor. This is when it's not. And I think that's always important to have this data, because a lot of times we live in a world where it's not working perfectly. So on here, if you watch my mouse pointer, this is screenshots from an Apple iPhone. This is telling you right here that your suspect's device currently has telephony turned on, it has wireless turned on, and it has Bluetooth turned on. So it has all of these signal settings turned on. All I can do on this is if I click on these options, I will then turn them off. I know many of you are thinking, why wouldn't I just pick airplane mode? Airplane mode is not your best option. You want to manually make sure that you turn off each of the different wireless options instead of selecting airplane mode. Airplane mode only turns off one of the functions, not all of the functions. And that's where you start getting into trouble. This is something that you should also make sure is happening when you're using any type of professional services, that they're maintaining the device in a completely wireless off state, so in that cone of silence. You can also see it here in the dialog associated with the Apple. Now, when you go to an Android device, since many of you might not use both, this you can see we have wireless on, we have Bluetooth on, we have location services on, and that's it on this particular device. We also have an option where we could do near field communication when it comes to an Android devices, which is the NFC and payment right there. So I didn't see anything over here that tells me it's on, but over here in the connection dialog, I do. By going through and selecting to turn off these different options, I'm ensuring I have the most protection possible for my evidence, so it doesn't end up being disrupted by some other device connecting to it or a remote command that could end up wiping the device. So this is your best possible practices when dealing with these devices. The optimal option is, of course, using a Faraday bag. I have the pictures of the Paraben Faraday bags, and I have those up because I am the patent holder on the EMI shielding container, which is a Faraday bag. And this is our design here. This will block all the latest devices, all the way through the latest iPhones and the latest Android devices. It has multiple linings with it, and it even has a copper shielding in the Velcro style closure on it. Now, the other thing you might notice on my slide here is I have power supplies that go with the Faraday bag. The goal is that your device is going to get to the lab that it needs to get to within a period that the battery will hold out. So they get it as close to that original seizure state as possible. One of the ways you do that is with remote battery supplies. We have a first responder bundle that puts multiple sizes of bags together with power supplies, and then you just keep those charged, you plug them in, put the device with the plug inside the bag, seal everything, put it in some bubble wrap, and then throw it into FedEx or to UPS, and then make sure it gets off to your lab. That's a perfect day. Everything's going well, and the lab knows it's coming in and it's optimal protection, and they're going to handle it separately and differently based on the protection you do.
Amber,
otherwise, they risk having the evidence damaged. Yeah.
we have a question. Wouldn't you shut off the mobile data as well on the device?
Yeah, you shut up all of them. When you do the mobile data, typically that's with the telephony options that gets turned off as well. Okay. So that's your seizure. Seizure is the easiest stage. It's the most interaction you're going to do with your client. It's the most interaction you're probably going to do with your evidence. After that, you're either going to start up your own lab and we have a longer discussion to have, or you're going to be hiring an outside lab to do it. And then they're going to jump in to that imaging and acquisition stage. It's important that we eliminate the difference between these two terms. And I'm going to talk about that because I think the whole webinar actually was inspired because I was talking to a private investigator out in California, and she mentioned what she had received from a different firm. And I was really disappointed to hear that they had taken advantage of her and what she was actually receiving for what she paid. And so that's what inspired this entire webinar to be given, to just give you guys the knowledge and information to make sure that you're going in with the best data possible to get the best data out. So let's talk about imaging. So imaging is first. Imaging is when you're dealing with computer data. We don't typically call it imaging when we're dealing with smartphones. That's when we call it acquisition, because there's different acquisition methods. We will end up with an image in the end, but we call it acquisition in the process. And it's just different terminology based on the industry norms, we'll call it that. So with imaging, with forensic imaging on a computer, we're doing a bitstream image, which means we're starting at that very first part of it and we're going to the very end of it. So my example to you is if I had a book and I do a forensic image of a book, that forensic image of the book would include everything from the types of inks that were used to print the title, to the glue they used to bind it together, to the sewing thread that they used to bind the pages to the glue. And all of those different things become part of that bitstream image. So I will know everything about that computer, and that is part of that process. Media cards, thumb drives, external hard drives, they also all get imaged. So they'll go through that same bitstream imaging process. When I go through and I do a computer in the bitstream image, typically I'm going to use something called a write blocker. That write blocker is to guarantee that I'm not going to go in and make writes and changes to that computer while I'm working on it. There are lots of different ones out there. They range in price from $300 up to $1,200. You can spend a bunch of money on them, or you can spend the bare minimum. But they are what are standard in digital forensics to guarantee that you're maintaining the best possible evidence.
Amber,
Yes.
we have a question that goes back to the shipping and securing of the device. If the device is powered on, is it a problem with UPS or FedEx because of the lithium battery?
It is not. Typically, they will ask you when you put it through that says, do you have a lithium battery? A lithium battery won't change on its risk, whether it's on or it's off. It's the battery itself is a risk. They typically just require you to put a note. We have stickers that we put on our boxes, but they also have them. If you go to the UPS or FedEx store, they will add them to the box that will note that that happens. There are rare occasions they might charge you a surcharge. It's like $2.50 because it's a lithium battery. But in general, it doesn't affect whether or not it's going to ship one way or another because it has the battery, whether it's on or it's off. So, okay, and getting back to imaging, there's also a free imaging tool. You guys can go and hit up their website for it. There's a couple of them out there. One of the most common in digital forensics is FTK Imager. It is free. It's used by lots of different people out there. I don't know how intuitive it is because it's not my primary tool of choice. Not a big shock. We're competitors, so I probably wouldn't use their tool a whole lot. I am familiar with it. It does make a real forensic image, and it is an option for you to use. And it's nice because it's free. Everyone loves free. Typically, the image you're going to create or is created for you is going to be called an EO1. That's actually an encase image, or a DD image. DD stands for disk to disk. That one is my preferred image, and I like that because it's not proprietary. Where an encase image is proprietary and it has little tweaks in it that will change whether or not it's read really well by certain tools. So I always prefer that when I hire outside services, because I have a firm that I use if I need them in investigation, because we can't do our own work, that they do everything in a DD image as opposed to an encase image. A lot of times it's the forensic examiner's preference. So now we're to acquisition. Acquisition, as I mentioned, is talking about smartphones. So smartphone acquisition is when we're creating that forensic image of a mobile device. It's done by different methods. So that's where it's a little different than the computer option, because the computer option is always the same. It's a bitstream image. So it's the exact same process no matter what you're imaging. But when you deal with a mobile phone and typically a smartphone, like I said, you're dealing with an acquisition option. So you're either going to get a logical image, a physical image, or a chip dump image. Each one of those can be done by a variety of different tools out there, from tools Paraben offers to tools that Celebrate offers to tools that Oxygen offers. There's a huge bunch of choices out there because this is the hot topic of the day, because smartphones are going through the roof and everyone has one. So it's important to understand when you get your images or your acquisition files associated with your smartphone, you know what type you're getting. So let's talk about our types. So logical acquisition. This is typically your active and recent inactive content from the device. So I'm going to go back to my book. If I were doing a logical acquisition of that book I talked about earlier, that would be the same as me ripping out all the pages of the book and all the notes that you might have taken in the margins, all the fold downs of the pages, all of that information, and that would become my logical image. That's the same when I look at that smartphone. All of those pieces come together to create that logical image. Now, let's say you erase that note you put in the margin because you were going to give the book to someone else. That data could then be recoverable as well. So it's just the same as working with that book. For a physical acquisition, that's when I'm going to get the cover of the book. I'm going to get the binding of the book. I'm going to get the glue of the book. All of those things become more traditional to like that bitstream image I mentioned with the computer type. So physical image is the closest I can get to that. The reason you don't get that every time with the smartphone is that there's such a huge variety of smartphones. It's just not possible with all of them. It doesn't matter what tool you use, it's just not possible on 100% of the devices. So that's why you're going to get a variety of different acquisition types. With a physical image, this is one of the options that allows you to bypass passwords on a device. Where on a logical image, I can't bypass your password. You have to hand me the book first. So the last image, this one's probably the most complex out of the three of them. That's our chip dump image. This is a software-based method that allows me to go back to the publisher of that book, find out all the details about the book, and then image all those details. Because instead of talking directly to that book to get my image, I'm talking to the chip on the board. So I still get even more information about it, and I am also able to bypass any protection when I use the chip dump method.
Amber, we have a question on that section. He's asking about what about a BG chip off? And I'm assuming he's talking about a chip off, not a chip dump.
Right, so a chip off method is when you actually desolder the chip off the board, and then you get a raw dump file with it. It's a .bin file is typically what's produced with that. That chip off method has become a little less popular now, and the reason is most of our chips that come from smartphones come from China. China has chosen to encrypt those chips more and more frequently, and so it's harder to be able to get past that in the chip off method. You're going to end up with just a bunch of encrypted data. When you do a chip dump image, I'm still talking to the chip, and I'm still able to have that chip input the keys in to gain access to the data in a non-encrypted form. So that's the difference between the two, is unfortunately with a chip off method, you won't always get the data in a non-encrypted form. There are times that a chip off where you actually desolder the chip off the board are very advantageous. And there are some great firms around the country that do this. I work with one firm up in Ohio, Binary Intelligence. They do a wonderful job. They have very reasonable rates, and they're fantastic. But do I always get access to the data? I don't, and that's not their fault. It's the fault of the device. So you have to be willing to spend that extra money to get to that point to do a chip off versus a chip dump.
Also on the same line, we have which acquisition do you try first if you have the password, and which one do you try if you do not have the password?
So if you have the password, you do the logical acquisition first. Then you do a physical acquisition if that's possible with the device. But the default acquisition you should get almost all the devices that are unlocked is a logical acquisition. If it's supported with the different tools you might be using, you would also then get a physical acquisition as well. So you'll typically get 2 acquisition files associated with a phone if it's supported. If you do not have the password and it is locked, your first approach is going to be the physical acquisition or the chip dump image. You're going to go to one of those bottom 2. So I've listed them in the order that is typically done by most labs. this is what you get. So this is the important part, because this is where you step in, that you can get the data back from a lab and then you start reviewing it. So this here is clean, readable data. It's super easy for you to read through. You can see date and time stamps. You can see the phone number that came back and forth, and you can see the text message data associated with it. This is what readable data is that doesn't always look fantastic because it came from a different method. So this data here came from a chip dump image. So we bypassed the password on the device, and this is how the data looks when you bypass the password. It's a little more raw, and instead of getting a cake that's all baked and put together, you're now getting it in its ingredients. And you as the investigator either has to pay the lab to put those ingredients together, or you have to start navigating through the data yourself to find it. You see in my example here, I'm looking at someone's phone book though, and it's pretty easy to navigate to say I have Kim Wills in here and her phone number, and Adam and Carla W, etc. I have all that information in there, and I can still see it. I can copy it, I can provide it to my client, and I can still do the analytics in my case without the forensic person. It's just up to you on whether or not you're going to go through that. We'll probably have a beginner's review of how SQLite works, which is what this data is you're looking at now, in a different webinar or in a video webinar that we'll provide out.
Amber, as someone else is saying, most of the time data that is needed is acquired through physical acquisition, but it doesn't always work. What can be the workaround?
It depends. It has to go back to the tools. So if physical acquisition doesn't work with one tool, then you need to do it with a different tool. No tool is perfect, and I make tools for a living, and no tool is perfect. I wish I could say that, but the fact is, if you can't get it with one, you're going to have to try with another one. If that doesn't do it, a lot of times the data is gone. I'm actually going to show you a chart that I made. Well, it's kind of a chart, a list that shows you what the data retention is, because I think part of the problem is that you might have higher expectations of the amount of recoverable data that's available than what is actually available. I think that's actually in the next couple slides. So our special considerations that we have here for Apple devices: if you have someone doing an Apple image for you, make sure you're asking for both a logical image that's typically done with an iTunes backup. You can also ask your clients to make an iTunes backup for you, and you can process it just like a logical image. And you also need to ask for an encrypted backup of the device. That's one of the flaws, is if you only get one, you actually are missing data without having the second. So an encrypted backup gives you data called keychain data. Keychain data has information such as the passwords, web forms they might have filled out, internet passwords for different sites that they go to, Wi-Fi access points with geolocation information, cryptographic keys, etc. Information that for you as a private investigator could be super valuable in your investigation. So you want to make sure you go through that extra step. If there's enough interest, we can do a specific webinar on this type of data and the type of data we get from each type of device. For Android. So Android has different layers to its data. So it also has media cards and SIM cards associated with it. Both of those should be part of your initial image you get from a lab, because they get processed differently. Remember, I told you a media card gets processed like a computer. So it gets a bitstream image made of it. So it has a secondary image. So you want to make sure that they're not shortchanging you out of that, because the data recovery on a media card is over 30 days, which is much higher than what you can get off of the Android device itself. For a SIM card, they're super easy to image. There isn't a ton of data on them, but it is one of those that, to follow the letter of the rules, you want to make sure that you get an image of it as well. We've recently, in the last week and a half, put out a free version of the E3 forensic platform that you can all download, and you can actually image your own SIM cards with it. That was one of the functions that we put in the free version. So in the end, this is what you get as an investigator. So you should receive an image file with hash values associated with it. Those hash values are our mathematical fingerprint we use in forensics to guarantee it's proper and done correctly and it has not changed. A documentation of the process the lab did, so they should have notes on that they can provide to you as well. Technically, and this is an opinion, some places will bill you for processing time, but you need to ask up front if that is something that they do. For example, If I am processing an iPhone physically and it's going to take 8 hours to process, you don't get billed for the 8 hours of the computer thinking. That's something you need to ask the lab up front before you receive your bill, so you don't end up getting a bill much larger than you were expecting because they billed you for the time the computer was doing the work. There is an exception to that if you are doing very specific cryptographic things, so password breaking, things like that. They will bill you for the time because that computer is dedicated to just breaking your stuff. But it should be at a lower rate than a person time should be billed at. And the last time is you need to understand you will always be billed for the media that you receive your image on, because they have to use fresh media with every case they work. So they're just going to add that to your bill, and that's pretty standard. So now let's go into the analysis. This is the basics. There could be lots of webinars going into huge detail. So we're going to shoot for the basics and then get you started. There are lots of different YouTube videos we have on the data that you can get from different types of devices, different apps, etc. on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to it. It's called Paraben Forensics, all one word. And if you subscribe, anytime we put a new video on that YouTube channel, you automatically get a notification. So that makes it super easy for you. So your analysis checklist is to make sure when you get data from a lab that they have processed it for you. So you should get textual data. You should tell the lab up front if they have multiple languages. So if your suspect's bilingual, make sure that you ask them to process it in both English and Spanish, for example. Indexing is the most common way to prepare data to be searched. So you can ask them if they're going to do an index. They should produce deleted or recovered data for you. That should be part of their initial processing of the data, if that is the steps that you are paying for. You should ask them to do an OCR, which is optical character recognition. I have a good example for you on that one. This is very important with mobile devices because that's going to change what you're able to see in your searches. And then they're going to carve data out from an allocated space. And I'm going to expand on that just a little bit for you so that you can see what the depths of the data is that you can potentially recover. So first, searching. This is the easiest part. You can totally do this, which means make sure you know what languages you're searching for. Be exact with your terms if you're going to have the firm search for you. Most of the time, it's a limited number of search terms, so be very careful with your choices. You can do combinations of those words, like amber and paraben together. I want to see when those two terms appear in the same document or file as one coordinating word. Not, I want amber, I want all things of paraben. If you're really interested in when amber and paraben are together, then make sure you say, I want them both together. That way it can only count as one search string as opposed to two. And then make sure you try to limit it by date range. When you start processing larger volumes of data, you get a lot of stuff. So if you want to make it so you're limiting down what you're getting, say, I'm interested in things from February to the end of March. And that way you know you're limiting within that zone. When you look at the deleted data recovery, here's your expectations. So file system data, which is where our computers and our media cards come in. Typically 30 days or older when you will get still deleted data from them. That's a huge advantage. They have a larger storage capacity. They're structured very different than how mobile devices are, so you're able to get more deleted data with them. With mobile data, we actually call it recovered data, but iOS, it's not a great opportunity for you to get a lot of data. I know it's terribly disappointing to everyone, and now everyone just did a big old sigh of, oh. The reason is Apple has changed their structure so much, especially with iOS 13, that a lot of the data that was recoverable before is no longer recoverable. They've started to overwrite that data, and so you're not able to access it. So that might be why you're disappointed in some of the computer forensic or digital forensic work that you get done, is that the data is simply not recoverable. With Android, it depends on how they access the device, which is a topic for a different webinar, but that can go up to 7 to 10 days. My device, I processed it this morning in a different webinar I gave, and I had 10 days of recoverable data that I was still able to show what had happened with my device over the last 10 days. So it is very hit and miss. There's a lot of variety of different Androids out there. So it's hard for you to know exactly what you're going to get. And it's hard for the lab to estimate that for you. But this gives you kind of a baseline that you can go to your clients with saying, this is roughly what we think we're going to be able to get, because a happy client makes you happy. So let's look at OCR. So this is my perfect example. I think Shannon's my really good example of this. So she will send me receipts when she travels, and she'll send it via her phone. Now, if I were going and I were committing some type of fraud, I would do the same thing. I keep track of all my data and photos because I know that a lot of forensic people don't go through an OCR. This is why it's valuable for you. So on the one side, you see a copy of that receipt from Walmart. It is not searchable. So as it looks like that, I can't search it. So if I were looking at this in digital evidence and I was searching for the words save money, I would not find any hits on it. So I'd get no results. But if I go on the right, after the data has been OCR'd, I can look at any of that data because it's been processed to be searchable. You just have to make sure that the tools that your forensic person is using have the ability to do this type of function. If it's in multiple languages, you do have to enable that. It's by default usually in a tool where it does all Spanish, all English, whatever it may be. If you know your suspect is bilingual, make sure you tell your forensic person up front because they have to change what their processing is.
Amber, we do have a question. They want to know in mobile how easy it is to get location data.
Location data on a mobile, it depends on the mobile device and what it's coming out of. So the nice thing is a lot of the different apps are now storing location data. So you don't have to just strictly rely on the device data itself. You can get location data associated with Facebook. You can get it with WhatsApp. You can get it with a variety of different apps. So that location information, you want to make sure that you're looking for it in multiple sources. The problem with finding location data is just a random string of numbers. It doesn't have a set format that's a guarantee every time. So it's very difficult to search for when you look through the raw data itself. It's a very time-consuming process. So keep that in mind if that's your suspect's primary interest in their digital evidence, that there's going to be a lot more billable time with it because you're going to have to spend more manual time looking into each one of these different areas to get it back. Okay. So our next section is our data carving section, and I have an example here of my wolf. At the front of every file, there is a header. That header identifies what type of file it is. So this file is a JPEG. That is what happens in the data carving process. So my example is myself. So at the header of my file, it says I am a ginger. At the footer of my file, it says I'm 5'10". So when I go and data carve for information that might be about me, I'm looking for a header of a ginger and a footer that says 5'10". Once I find those, my tool is going to go through and carve out that information and then recover a picture of me. Now, the problem you have when you carve from different places, this is kind of like looking for that needle in a haystack. It can be kind of messy and you might be missing portions of it. So just like you can only see a part of me in the video Zoom, that bottom half of me would be missing in the carving, but I still am able to recover the top half. That's part of that process that happens with data carving.
We have a couple more questions.
Yep.
Is it true that WhatsApp is so secure that we cannot recover data from it?
No, it is not true. You can. There is a YouTube video on our YouTube, again, Paraben Forensics, and you can see what type of data can get recovered out of WhatsApp.
Also, are you able to access the health data on an iOS device?
Depending on your tool, yes. And it's whether or not the tool will make it that pretty data I showed you, or if you'll have to manually go through and get the data separately. But on the firmware version, the health data is recoverable. Okay. So here's your other data carving example. This is one that you'll see over here. I show a cluster. I've recovered the data here, which is a zip file, and we see it's textual data. So it doesn't matter what kind of header and footer a file has, it can all be recoverable. It's all based on the tool and the skills of your examiner. On your computer analysis, here are your tools that you can get for free. If you want to super nerd up and see things in their raw naked form, you need a hex viewer. I doubt many of you will be super interested, but I have a link in there for one that's free. There's a great file viewer called View. It's free for personal use, but it has file viewers for thousands of different files. So I'm a big fan of that one. The other is LibreOffice. LibreOffice is a free version of Office, but it allows you to see data from Office files in context in one another. So I'm a big fan of it for looking at like Excel spreadsheets without having to have an Office license, etc. Make sure if you're working with an investigator or a forensic group that any of the files you feel comfortable in reviewing yourself, you can ask them to export that data out and then you can review it in context of your investigation. That allows you to get the billable time in with your client as opposed to having the forensic person do that work for you. For our device analysis, again, this is probably your easiest to review because you guys are super familiar with mobiles because you all have one. So some of the tools out there have review versions available. We have a review version so you can look at mobile data in context. It is typically proprietary, so it's not as easy as looking at a spreadsheet. But the easiest thing for you to do with a forensic lab is to just ask for a report that covers a very big grouping of whatever that data may be. So if you're working only in text messages, ask them for a report of all the text messages. They can typically output it as spreadsheets or a CSV file that you can import in as a spreadsheet, and then you can get to work and looking for what your client wants. Here's an example report for you of data that we've output using the E3 platform. And now we're to our last section, and right in time too, we'll be close. So how digital forensic services are billed. So understanding your fees and options. I have redacted a bill down here that was from another firm, not ours, just to let you see kind of how people break it down in other places. So they have a mobile phone logical extraction. We've talked about that logical image. So there's one of those keywords. It talks about the tool that they use for it. So you use the Celebrite UFED. It talks about the media fee. We mentioned that. And then they have a junior consultation in there going through the report with you. So be aware and make sure that you know whenever you call a forensic examiner, it's the same as when your client calls you, that they're going to bill you for that time. They're just like lawyers in that aspect as well. So they're going to keep track of it in incremental times. So, sorry about that. Here's your pricing structures. So it was the closest map I could find that would really work this out for you. Based on the region of the country you're in, you're going to get charged different fees for different services. Every area of the country has different licensing requirements as well. If you're doing work in Texas, you have to have a PI's license in Texas to do digital forensic work as well. So you guys know all about those rules for licensing, so make sure you're using a firm that is appropriate for that. Here is your basic analysis as an example of what Paraben does. So our basic analysis includes your image and acquisition. Searching for up to 5 search terms, an OCR of the data. We automatically carve it, we do a report, and we give you a data review tool. Hang on. It's allergy season for me too, so I'm having a hard time with pollen. So that usually is at your flat rate, and then as far as our rates go, and then after that flat rate, you go to an hourly. This is how the rate breakdown works kind of around the country. You go for computer forensic work, it's typically at a higher rate. It goes from 500 to 2,500 per machine, sorry. That includes your image, your basic analytics, and your report at very minimum. So if they aren't giving you that as part of that flat fee, then you need to ask them what they're including in it. It shouldn't just be the imaging stage of it. That's when they're shortchanging you. And you should discuss that with the firm you're using. On mobile forensics, you bill out between 500 to 1,500 per device. That includes the image and your basic analysis. That's pretty normal. Many times, you can also pay an extra fee that's a little smaller to have it imaged with a second tool as part of that imaging process. That way you get 2 different images to look at. So if one tool isn't producing what you wanted, then you can see what the other tool might produce. Like I said, it's impossible to get 100% of the data all the time when it comes to smartphones. There's just too big a variety out there. So this allows you to have that variety with it. The hourly rates will range differently throughout the country. And as you saw in my example there, there's junior examiners versus senior examiners. Sometimes they'll charge different rates based on that. But in general, they're from $150 to $250 plus an hour. You go to the larger firms, they're going to be much higher than that. So you're kind of paying attention to what you want from the firm you're working with. Expert testimony is typically double the hourly rate associated with whatever examiner that you're working with. Make sure that they have someone in the firm that is a qualified expert that could go in and support you in court if you needed it. It doesn't necessarily always have to be the same person who did your initial examination, but it has to be someone in that firm that's willing to review that data and make sure they can give testimony. Whenever you hire an expert in computer forensic work, it typically has a minimum number of hours that you hire them for no matter what, and it's typically paid up front. The big thing as well, remember, none of your fees ever include media, shipping, or travel associated with an expert or a pickup of a piece of evidence. There is nothing wrong where no one is really doing a lot of travel right now in having your devices, whether it be computers or mobiles, shipped to a lab for processing. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It still follows all the rules of best practices. So after all this, you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so fascinated with doing computer forensics and digital forensics in general, and now we want to make our own lab. It can be very profitable for you, and it can be a nice add-on service for you. You do have some rules with it, and you have to do some investment of your own to make it a good service for you to offer. So first, make sure you have a separate machine for forensics. It does not have to be the most stellar machine, but it can't be the worst machine on the planet either. You need at least 16 gig of RAM to be able to have a forensic machine function well, and I would recommend having a larger storage capacity drive on it as well to make sure you're going to get the best out of it. Make sure you're purchasing tools that are forensics that are validated and made by reputable companies. You don't want to just buy the cheapest thing that you randomly saw when you were Googling, because you never know what you're going to end up getting. So make sure that you know that the company has a reputation in the space. That's always a good rule of thumb. Whatever area you're going to offer, let's say you only want to offer mobile forensics, get trained in that area. Make sure that you understand the principles of it, how to process it before you start offering it out to your clients to make sure that you are up to speed on it. And then start following some of the influencers in that space and social media so you stay up to speed of what happens. Digital forensics changes pretty often. And so it's important to make sure you're staying up to date with the latest trends and tricks and different things like that. It's one of the reasons I recommend you subscribe to the YouTube, is it's a great way to watch a video on something that might have recently changed with it.
Amber, can you address on this section about training and court certified training?
Okay. So there's always that big question about what has the court certified. So the court doesn't certify anything at the end of the day. You just have to make sure that you're getting valuable training, that you have learned what you need to. It is better if you have a certification that it has a lab, it has a written examination with it, and things you have to maintain. That's something they're going to ask you is how well are you trained in this particular topic? We all know that what makes you an expert is knowing more than the lay person, but what makes you an expert in computer forensics is usually years of study and staying on the topic, so you can improve that overall. I don't do a lot of network forensics anymore, so I would never qualify myself as an expert in network forensics. Do I understand it? Do I know how it works? Yes, but I'm not a qualified expert because I haven't got specialized training in network forensics. So when you go out and decide to do training, it's good when you can do multiple levels of it, that you can do continuing education with wherever you're getting the training from. I always recommend you also get it from more than one source. I think that's very valuable. Right now, because of the current COVID crisis, there is actually a lot of free training opportunities as well online on these particular topics. And so you can kind of get different perspectives on it, which is very valuable in the field. Okay. The last two sections real quick are your release forms and policies. Make sure you have those in place. Forensics is a science, so you have to actually have a policy, or I call it your processing steps that you go into it when you do it. So every time I process a device, I follow the exact same processing checklist. It's why in the end, I decided to make you guys a checklist to get into digital forensics, so you knew when you were working with a firm, you could fill out this checklist and know you got everything you needed in the process. It is very science driven in that aspect. It is not an official accredited science, however. So it is not one that I have to have a degree in chemistry to be able to do it, or biology, but it is one that you have to follow scientific steps for. So that's where that last little bit was with a standardized process. I have a notebook, a binder in our lab that is what our set standard processes are for our lab. And I made sure everyone, before they process any evidence, understand all the processes, they fill out all the paperwork. It's a lot of extra little steps, but in the end, it makes sure that you're always producing the best possible evidence. When I hire someone, the lab that I keep on retainer for Paraben, I have made sure that I also understand what their processes are, they have it documented, and they're doing everything properly as well. So in closing, I recommend you kind of look at some of the social media sides. You all know how valuable social media is. You probably heard about this webinar on social media. You can follow us on Facebook. We're Paraben Corp on Facebook. On LinkedIn, it's Paraben-Corporation, and you can follow us there to get different updates. We run different specials out that way as well for our followers so that they know when they can get discounts. And then the last one I really recommended was the YouTube. I never thought I would be in a generation that I liked watching videos of how to do stuff as much as I do, but YouTube can be a valuable resource for you. And so I recommend that you maybe look at subscribing to a couple of the valuable channels. Ours is Paraben Forensics. And then anytime new content's uploaded, it just sends you an email or an update to your Gmail account. So super easy to do. So that's the close of our webinar. I've got my contact details here as well as Shannon's. We'll be reaching out to all of you to give you the checklist that I've talked about. And then you're welcome to ping us and ask for additional information. If you've subscribed and opted in, anytime we have a new webinar that's in your zone, so investigative zone, we'll let you know when those are available so you can take a look at it. We had a free Facebook webinar on data you can get from Facebook. That free version of the E3 platform I mentioned to you earlier supports getting Facebook data from the cloud for free. So it's kind of a nice bonus for your Thursday afternoon. So are there any other questions real quick, Shannon?
I think we're good.
Okay, if you do have any other questions, again, you're welcome to email us. It's amber@paraben.com or it's shannon@paraben.com. We'll be getting that information out to you before Monday, so you'll get your checklist in the next day. And we appreciate you joining us today.